My name is Clint Simmons, and I'm from the Warrenton community of Pensacola, Florida. I have always wanted to be an engineer and a pilot. I entered the Air Force right out of high school, and after I completed my training in Texas, I was stationed out here in California. And after completing my military career, I went on to college. And completing college, I became an electronics engineer. And during that time, I wanted to work in the aerospace industry. And I was able to get a job with the Aeronautics Division of North American Aviation right out of college as a research engineer. I completed my schooling right out of a high school, and I used the JPL to get my advanced degree as well as my undergraduate degree. I always wanted to be in business for myself, and I had a little company called Electron Manufacturing. And doing that, I was unable to get any big jobs, but I was still working full time. And at the aching of one of the engineers that I had been associated with, he said, "Well, Clint, there is a black company out in El Monte which they need an engineer to complete some projects that they had just purchased." The company was owned by a fellow named Jim Woods, who was a Tuskegee Airman instructor back in World War II. He had bought the company from this white company, and they had promised him that they would finish up the projects that they had started, and that didn't happen. So they was in the process of trying to take the company back, and I went out, and we was able to complete the contract that was part of the deal when they bought the company out. And on those, one of the projects that we had was over-the-horizon communication. That was that they had two amplifiers that they had to build for the Navy. One was to be used on the ship, and the other one was to be used in the tower there at the Naval Air Station there in Long Beach. And in that particular operation, you had a low frequency that they was using as an angle, and then using a high frequency to bounce off of that low frequency, and so that's how they was able to communicate over the horizon. From that, on 1966, right after the Watts riot, we had a gentleman to come from Aerojet General. He said he was the chief executive officer of Aerojet, and he came into our company after we had moved from El Monte to Compton. And he came in and said that he wanted to sponsor us. And I said, "Well, sponsor for what? All you need to do is just tell your purchasing agent when I come out, look at me as another businessman, not as a black person." So he said, "That's not the way things are done." And the owner of the company, he wasn't there, Jim Woods, at that time, so he did come in the next day, and we discussed the proposal that had been put forth by the Aerojet CEO. And I found out that he was the Secretary of the Navy under President Truman at the time. His name was Dan Kimball. They wanted to make that electronics in order to generate business in the area after the Watts riot. And I wasn't interested in being sponsored by anybody, so I departed from the Woods systems and moved my own company down into Compton, further down on Central Avenue. After they changed and went to change the company name to Watts Manufacturing, which they built bats and did a lot of stuff for the post office department. So I was just doing my own thing with the Electron Manufacturing. So I changed it to Electron Enterprises. One of my first big project for the aerospace industry was a filter where the Delta program had failed twice, and they found the reason for it. It was a ripple from the power supply, and they needed a filter to take the ripple out in order to have the program to be a success. And I was one of the 39 people who they gave a bid to, just to see what I would do. That's all they were looking at. But I came back after 2.5 weeks with a breadboard, letting them know that I knew what I could do. So they issued, to make it short, they issued 9 contracts as a result of that. And I was the first one to finish. They tested mine, they sent it to One went to Cape Canaveral, the other went out to Douglas and Santa Monica at the time. And Cape Canaveral put it on, it flew, it became a success, so Electron Enterprises became known then in the aerospace industry as a production, that can produce equipment sufficient for space. How I got tied in with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1968, a member of DCAS, that's the Defense Contract Agency Service, told me, he said, they need you out at JPL. And I said, no, they don't need me out there, because I had tried to get a job out there. He said, no, they need you out there now. So I went on out, and I hooked up with the contract company called Job Shoppers at the time. And so they hired me for a 6-month deal. And this was on the Mars 69, which is Mars Mariner 6 and 7. And back in those days, they was building 2 rockets whenever they fired in space. And during that 6 months period, I was able to find a problem that was associated with the instrument boom. In other words, that's the arm that sticks out from the spacecraft as it flying towards a planet, and then that arm will always be pointed at that planet while the spacecraft passed by. And they was having a problem with the jitter in the arm. It wasn't stabilized. And if it's not stable, you don't get good data, and you don't even get good video in that respect. So I was able to get that resolved for them in the 6 months period that I had in the contract. And that is how I became recognized at JPL. And they were a little hesitant about me out there, so I don't know if it was because the government had sent me out, or if I was doing the job that they wanted me to do, or whatever the case may be. So once that was completed and they launched, and it was a success, so I had completed my job with them at that time, and I moved on back to my company, and I was able to go to other companies and work as a consultant and etc. And then in 1974, I called my ex-boss at JPL, and that's how I got back in 1974 as a contractor. And then I was working on the Voyager 1 and 2 and some of the other areas over in the parts engineering. In the parts engineering group is where they needed people to work, because once you launch a spacecraft, you can't have a failure. If you have a failure, you can't bring it back and repair it. So everything had to be tested and meet all of the standards that was needed for the electronic parts to operate in the spacecraft to make it a success. And that is how I got back in, and I was on other projects, including starting with the fiber optics. I did a lot of the early work on the fiber optics, and I was with other programs at the Jet Propulsion Lab, but the main one was the Voyager 1 and 2, and I think that is about how I can sum up my tour there. But I also was a volunteer with the Alpha Association, which we went out to various schools and was encouraging the young people how to study and become engineers or scientists or whatever the case may be. And we were more like role models to them in that respect. And so with that type of introduction, and that's how I got started. And that's how I stayed with JPL until I retired in 1996.
My name is Bill Jackson, better known to the group as B or Biscuit. I'm originally from the state of Kentucky. Willis and I are practically neighbors. We grew up in the same neighborhood, same kind of background and stuff. Modest high school career, the sports and so forth and so on. Upon graduation, attended Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. After a couple of years, I upset my father because I had quit and joined the Marine Corps. Went to Vietnam, 1965, March of 1967, 18 months, excuse me. During that time, the government sprayed the Agent Orange. We've all heard of the Agent Orange. And I was one of those victims that was affected by some of the effects of Agent Orange. And had no problem getting the government to do their share, and they took care of it. So upon getting out of the Marine Corps, I came to Pasadena and worked briefly with the McDonnell Douglas out in Torrance. And then I started meeting, seemed like the people I met were from JPL. I think I'm the only one of the group that's not from JPL that was in the space program. I took up, I got into law enforcement in 1971. And 34 years later, I retired from the Elliott County Sheriff's Department.
I'm Willis Meeks, and after high school, I joined the Air Force and had a career in avionics. That's airborne electronics, the computers and all the brains of a rocket or a missile. That's what I did. Some of the stuff I helped design, and some of the stuff I maintained and whatever. So early on, after working on bombers and tankers and aircraft, when the missile program started, myself and 2 or 3 of our guys left Savannah, Georgia, and came to Vandenberg Air Force Base. We worked there before we had any hardware. We just went to school all the time, learning how the missile program operated. And then once we finally got hardware, we were really the pioneers. We were there for like 2 years before we ever launched a missile. But we learned a lot. We were grunts, actually, like 1 or 2 stripes. But because we were on the ground floor, we actually worked with contractors like Boeing, TRW, Rocketdyne, and all those guys. And since we had the time to spend, we were trained on everything to do with the missile program. And so I can recall we worked in the Western Test Range, and I can recall one day driving home from work, and I heard on the radio about this place where they were launching a mission to Mars. That was back in 1964. And I was excited about that. And so from that time, I was focused on going to this place, this JPL, Pasadena, California. And, you know, as God directs things in our lives, a couple of years later, I came down to JPL. It turns out that I was working on the Surveyor satellite. And since we just came on the 50th year of the landing on the moon, little is known about the Surveyor program. But before the Apollo program got started at JPL, we did all that stuff as part of the program. I mean, we flew the Surveyor to the moon and landed on the moon. And that was in June of 1966. It turns out that I was on the console talking to the tracking station, and when that first picture came down, I saw it. I was right there seeing it. Think about that. My heart rate just went crazy. And so we actually had the tracking network, and we actually trained and wrote the procedures for the people that worked on the Apollo program. I was a contractor for Bendix, and I was a network controller, which means, you know, when you hear people saying Australia coming up for a tracking pass, and then Madrid, Spain, I was a controller, and I controlled the network for all these stations. My team of controllers had to send directions to the station director on what they were going to do for the next tracking pass. And this went on for like years. And then one day, one of the government officials from Australia came And he came into network control, and he looked at me, and his face got strange, and he whispered to me, "You're black." So, well, eventually, I ended up as the project manager on Ulysses, the Ulysses program, which actually is the only mission we've ever had that flew over the poles of the sun. And that went for, well, from 1990 to like 2004. So it was exciting. We made contacts. We traveled all over the world. When I retired from JPL in 2003 or so, Ed Massey had joined us, and he worked with me, trained with me, and so when I left, he was prepared to take over as the project manager for Ulysses and some other stuff. So I just let him pick up. And
I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I was basically born there, raised there. Went through high school there, and then I went to Tuskegee Institute at the time, where I ended up with a Bachelor's in Science and Engineering, and also was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. My assignments in the Air Force, I stayed for 20 years, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. I dealt with primarily missile and reentry vehicles, data processing and analysis, tracking of military satellites, including communication satellites, navigation satellites, and what was called national assets. Once I retired from the Air Force, I joined JPL. Willis Weeks hired me as a administrative assistant, and through the years I became, in addition to administrative assistant, science instruments manager, and a deputy mission operations manager. And when Willis retired, I took over as project manager. I did that until the mission ended in 2008. About a year or so after I took that job, George Textor retired from Voyager, and I ended up with the Voyager project as well. So I did that until I retired. Voyager's still flying. Unfortunately, Ulysses is not. Over the years, there have been quite a few interesting things that happened. Of course, when I was manager of Voyager had already gone through its grand tour, but there were other things to be done, such as finding the termination shock, that area where the winds from the sun are equal to the winds from the outer space. And so that happened while I was the manager there. And of course, I was not there when this second spacecraft did the same thing. But over the years, I was the first, that I know of anyway, manager with two major projects like that. I retired in 2010.
We all are JPL ex-employees. I started there back in the early days of the contracting done by Bendix Field Engineering. And I think several of the guys, I know Meeks, we started working, I started working with Bendix Field Engineering. There was a man by the name of Lee Olzar was the managing at that time. Lee was he was a cool dude. He had the responsibility of getting the project, getting people to work on the project, work on the computers and be computer operated, et cetera, et cetera. That was his job. Bendix had won the contract. to JPL. JPL, and I'm going to be right up front with you, JPL had very few blacks working there. I use blacks, didn't I? The word in those days were Negroes or colored people, okay? Had very, you know what I'm saying? Had very few of those people working there. And so Leozar had to go out and get some Negroes, some colored people, okay? Yeah. So he did. He came to me. Well, no, he didn't come to me. It was advertised in the Pasadena Star News that JPL needed some computer operators. Now, I'm an alumni of Tuskegee Institute, Alabama, and I'd moved to California with the intention of going back to Alabama and complete my degree there. But that didn't happen because I met two sisters from Houston, Texas, told me that they are hiring people at JPL, black people. So I said, okay. So I applied in December of, I think it was 03. I'm sorry, 63. I applied. He said, okay. Well, show up next year, January 6th. I said, okay. So I told my future wife that I had a job at JPL. She got excited. And I can't think of the guy's name. We were working for Bendix Field Engineering. Leo Zar was the head man of Bendix Field Engineering. And I looked around and I saw one black in building, we call building 230, up the computer building. I saw one black guy there. Now I saw this black guy every time I walked by a computer. That was me. I didn't see any of the black guys. You know, so I stayed there and I worked and I did my job, learning how to run, what did they call it, the 40s, the 1994s, or whatever you call those things. So I stayed there for a while, and I worked there. I worked there at JPL for 16 years. Then I eventually said I got enough. I was what we call computer burnout. You know, so I just left. I went to my supervisor and told him, I said, hey man, I'm leaving Friday. Ken, where you going? I'm getting out of here Friday. But you got to give
JPL experience.
Yeah, you got to give us a give us a notice, 10-day notice. Mm-hmm. I said, no, I'm gone. So come that Friday, he expected me to be the boy and take his word to stay. I went to him, I said, man, where's the paper I'm supposed to sign to get out of here? So they got the papers together, and he was shocked.
My background is originally science with Jackie. I knew Jackie from a while back. And organizational development, strategic management. Those are the areas that my expertise is supposed to be in. But what like all of you know is that you start one place and you end up another place. And now you'll attest to that as we go around this room. As far as coming, I started out as a teacher because I, like you, found somebody that I love, and but there was nothing out there, so I was taught to work. So the first thing out there was get a job, and I became a teacher. I came into JPL's family. My sister, didn't you know Vivi? You remember Vivi?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Vivi worked in professional development. Vivi's my sister. Vivi got on the phone and said, hey Greg, I got something for you. I think you'll like this.
And so I went and I interviewed. George Taylor hired me, and I came in as your career counselor. And then I worked from there to your employee relations person, sticking my nose in the stuff that was rather difficult. My responsibility was to help people who needed help, who were their supervisors and so on and so forth, were not treating them right, and finding ways to put them in the back in the dark, and not being supportive of who they were and how to help them move forward. In that process, I met many of you at this table who were very helpful to me, because you don't live without that kind of help. But anyway, I went from there to I supervised training. One of the things I was proud of, remember the diversity training that you got when you went through? That was, I put that together. That was mine. That was the first thing. The manager, Jay Smucker, they'd come to us, and because they were getting complaints from all their supervisors, their white supervisors, to help them with their minority supervision. And it was coming from a variety of places. And we put this together. And it was shared. We were the first group in NASA to do that. It was shared throughout NASA, that particular training. It wasn't the best, but it was better than none. And it was appreciated. So the supervisors then had a way of being able to work. They felt comfortable that they had a tool to be able to assist them with being supervisors. Didn't make them the best, but they made them better. And over the years, I was in employee relations manager, and over the years, I've been able to work with people who help people. This is what this group does. And that's why it's so important to me. Willis grabbed a hold of me one day and said, "Hey, I want you to come on over here and you know some of these people," and I do. And I'm glad I have an opportunity to be a part of it, because anybody looking at this video will see that there's the kind of experience and the kind of acumen that is necessary to help our people. So if there's something that tweaks you, that excites you about what you see, get in contact. And that'll be available somewhere as we go along, because we have something to share, and we want to share it.
My name is Tillman Owens, and I'm a native Pasadenean. Grew up here, been here all my life. Only moved away for a short period of time, 6 months from Venice Beach. I found that drive from Venice Beach to JPL to be just too gruesome, too grueling. But the way I started working at JPL is, my story is I'm really a non-degree professional. And I went to school, I went to college, Pasadena City College. I just never graduated. In fact, I got burnt out working, partying, and homework. It just got to be too much, and I said, I'm going to take a break. I took a break, at the time I had $8 left to my name, and someone picked my pocket, took my money, or maybe I lost it. I was at a party one night, and there was a name that hasn't been mentioned, but I'm sure he was part of this group, and some of you probably know him as Real-Time Ron.
Whoa!
Real-Time Ron was telling a friend of mine that JPL wasn't meeting their requirement for hiring minorities. And I overheard this, so I needed a job. And that Monday, I went and applied, and the job I got was called an expediter. And the only requirement for that job was you needed to have a California driver's license. And when I got that job, the expediter, I drove a truck around the lab taking computer programs from one place to another to be processed. My supervisor told me at the time that in your spare time, you can learn to run these computers. And that's where I met Henry. Henry was a computer operator back in those days, but I started running those computers in my spare time, and I fell in love. I fell in love with computers. I mean, I only knew computers to be those things that were in the movies, but I found that those computers were really real. And I fell in love, and I started, taking classes and getting trained, and I grew from being an expediter to a computer operator to software engineer, software test engineer. One of the names that you've heard someone speak of, Roger Fox. Roger Fox was really instrumental in changing my attitude. Because when I started working at JPL, I was, for lack of a better term, I was really a cool jerk. But I was a smart cool jerk. I mean, I've always been a straight A student all my life, but I just always been cool too, you know. Roger had tried to get a job for me as a lead operator, as I was really deserving of it, because, I mean, but he got shot down trying to get me the job. He pulled me to the side one night after trying to get me this job for a whole week, and he told me, he said, "You know where I've been all week?" He said, "I've been trying to get your, you know what, a job. And when these people finished chewing on me, I didn't hardly have enough to go home and sit down on." That turned me around. That really turned me around. And within 6 months, I mean, I came out of the cool jerk thing at work, started dressing business casual, and within 6 months, I started climbing, and I never stopped climbing. And so I really owe a lot to Roger, and I think, the guys in this group are those kinds of people, and they have personally touched my life. I know at some point, 6 years in my JPL career, someone tried to fire me. Rosie saved my bacon. And I just found out last week that Greg was also part of saving my bacon. And so these guys are really helpful. And Mr. Willis has, from time to time, pulled me to the side and given me helpful advice, not all of which I did, follow, because I never got that degree, but I don't think there's a person on planet Earth who studies more than I do. I'm always studying, always learning, because I operate from the perspective that I got to know more, I got to be better. And I found that I had to be better and I had to know more to earn less than they did. But that's, they always knew what was happening. But that's my JPL experience, and I spent 21 years there. When I got laid off from JPL, I was a contractor. At that point, I was working for Telos Aerospace. When I got laid off, I was training college graduates to come in and take over my job.
Yeah. My name is Henry Dillard. I was born and raised in Pasadena. Did all my original schooling through high school and Pasadena City College. While I was at PCC, the president of the school convinced me to walk up a block to the off-site computer lab, which consisted of a plugboard computer in those days, with the little wires that ran between the plugs. Most of you probably don't even remember that stuff. And from there, I took an interest in computers and stayed in the computer department at Pasadena City College until I saw an ad similar to what Ken saw in the paper and actually applied to Bendix in 1967. And I was hired. I was hired for the graveyard shift, so I never saw anybody. But when they brought me to the daytime, there was a group that used to have lunch. And one of those people was Ken, one of those people was Willis, and we would all sit around and like the whole total black population at JPL was around this one table. And that's all there was. You could go anywhere else and there weren't any black people, except secretaries. And so I managed to make some progress at JPL and moved into software testing. And so I did some initial work on Mariner 69, one of the Pioneer missions. But the thing that strikes me most about going to those meetings for those missions was I was the only black anywhere in sight. There wasn't another black person anywhere to be found, anywhere on the team. So after a number of years, and making the unfortunate mistake of thinking software testing was not going to be a career, I left JPL and went to TRW, where I found software testing in a disciplined way was a career. And so I spent 12 years at TRW working mostly on classified missions. So I didn't have the space background that everybody else has. But I did all this classified work at TRW, and then the drive from Pasadena was a bit much for me. And so I reached out to a couple of friends, one of which was Willis, to circulate my resume at JPL. I got a call to come back to JPL from one of those resumes that Willis circulated. And now, when I came back to JPL, I again was doing military stuff. The first 3 or 4 projects I worked on at JPL were still military based, so I didn't really interact with a lot of these people because they weren't working the same kind of projects I was working. I was in pretty much a closed environment. And so now, going back to the original time when I was with Bendix, Roger Fox was a good friend of mine. He and I used to work together on a regular basis. But I never interacted on the space side. Fact is, when all of the military work at JPL ended, I had trouble getting a job because I didn't have any space background. So I ended up in the office of the CIO, still doing IT work, and that's where I retired from. So yeah, born and raised in Pasadena, educated in then I educated at PCC. I went to Cal State LA, graduated from Cal State LA, and then some years later I went to Azusa Pacific and got a master's in computer science. So that's been my career. One of the people I've known the longest is Willis. Tillman, almost as long. Ken, ancient history. He was old enough to be my dad when I was.
I'm Roosevelt Short, and I'll be telling you my story, how I came to JPL. I was born in a little place called Stanton, Tennessee, about 50 miles northeast of Memphis. I grew up on a farm, and this farm that I grew up on that has been in my family for almost 150 years now. I attended the school system in Haywood County, Tennessee, and ironically, the grammar school that I attended, my father built that school and gave it to the county so that the kids in our neighborhood would have some place to go to school. And there was only one black school in the county, a four-year high school in the county. And I entered the ninth grade at the school at the age of 13. I had a preoccupation with airplanes. I don't know why, because I'd never really seen an airplane up close. And one of my bucket lists, if I could put it that way, at that time as a kid, one of the things that I longed to do was to just fly in an airplane. Little did I know that before I left this earth, I would own a couple of airplanes. At 16, I became ill with an undefined illness. And I had to drop out of high school, and I was hospitalized on and off, for about 6 months. After being out a year, I graduated a year late from high school, and my father had sent me away to college. I went to Tennessee State for 1 semester, and since I graduated late, we still had the registration for the military service. I had to register, and then I was called to serve in the Army. And I had 5 brothers that went in the Army, and I heard these horror stories about how the Army treated people, so I definitely didn't want to do that. So I joined the Air Force. During the time I was in the Air Force, you had to take an aptitude test. Everyone took these tests, and your career field was based on your scores. So I evidently had scored high in science and technology at the time. So I was chosen to go to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, to train as an electronic technician. And after the electronic technician training, I was further trained into electronic countermeasures. And electronic countermeasures was a means for jamming enemy radars or enemy signals so that we could do what we wanted. I was in Biloxi for 1 day, and I was in jail. The very first day I arrived in Biloxi, for walking down the street with 2 white guys, 2 of my white colleagues that I'd gone through basic training with. We were put on the ground, all 3 of us, shotguns, cocked shotguns at our heads, and we were taken to jail, and we were fined exactly the amount of money that we had between us. After that experience, I decided that I didn't want to see Biloxi, Mississippi. After training in Biloxi, then I was sent to Orlando Air Force Base in Florida, and trained on the Matador ground-to-ground missile, which was a nuclear-tipped missile, which we were deploying around the world at the time. After training on the Matador ground-to-ground missile, each class then had to do a launch, an active launch. So we had to go to Cape Canaveral, it was Cape Canaveral at the time, to do our launch. We went down to the Cape, and there was no place for me to stay. I was the only black crew member on this particular crew. So the closest I could find a hotel to stay was in a little town called Titusville, which is about 20 miles north of the Cape. So this is how, you're treated. I'm good enough to train to give my life in the Air Force, but I'm not good enough to stay in one of the hotels on the beach. I was at the Cape when the fire occurred on the Apollo spacecraft. We were running tests on that spacecraft that day when Grissom, White, and Chaffee was killed in that fire. Never will forget that, because we didn't know what had happened. All we knew that we had dropped a signal between the spacecraft and the site. So after about 30 minutes, the security guards came in, and they locked all the doors to the site. Nobody was to leave. confiscated all the tapes, all of the data mediums, and they still didn't tell us what had happened. Half an hour, 45 minutes later, they told us that there had been a fire in the spacecraft. But we didn't know that there were anyone killed until that night when they finally let us go home. So after the first launch, my commanding officer asked me if I would like to retrain into a new system that was coming online. This time I was trained on the newest Air Force ground-to-ground missile, which was the TM-76 MACE missile. So I was trained as a training instructor on that missile. As a result of being trained on the guidance system, I also was trained as a launch control officer. So I went to school in Colorado, for 9 months. And it seemed like that's all I did while I was in the Air Force was to go to school. 9 months in Colorado and came back down to Florida. After 7 months in Orlando, I was reclassified and transferred to the United States Air Force in Europe. And the U.S. Air Force in Europe had a test range down in Libya. So I was sent there to train the technicians on how to launch a missile. One of the experiences that I had while in Libya, I guess the foremost experience, was the day that Omar Gaddafi showed up at the base. He was a 26-year-old colonel in the Libyan army and demanded that the U.S. Air Force vacate the base, leave all the airplanes and all our equipment on the base, and he was going to take over the base. Well, that didn't set very well with our people. But then while in Libya, I was training launch crews. And then one day, my commander came to me and he says, Rosie, we're going to promote this person, and I know you're the most qualified person for this job, but we're going to promote this person. So anyway, I said, why? If I'm the most qualified person for the job, why can't I have the job? He said, well, he has a wife and kids, and he want to bring his wife and kids to Libya. But you're young, and your day will come. So at that point, in my mind, I knew I wouldn't make a career in the Air Force. So I started my countdown to get out of the Air Force. And I was constantly being told that if you get out of the Air Force, there's nothing you can do. Your field is a specialty. It's secret. Nobody's going to hire you because you're black. And so your best bet would be to re-enlist in the Air Force and just stay in the Air Force. So that just gave me the fortification to get out of the Air Force. So I did. And when I had my exit interview, again, I was told by my superiors that you're not going to find a job, and you'll be back here begging to get back in the Air Force. So what they didn't know is that I had a job. I applied with a company that built boosters for rockets, and they were in Littleton, Colorado, and I was a test engineer for them. One day I saw a ad in the paper for people. They were recruiting for people on the distant early warning line in Alaska. I applied, and I got the job, and I was sent to a site 200 miles south of the North Pole, a place called Point Barrow on the Bering Sea. And my job there we were snooping on the Russians. We could, from our vantage point up there, when Russia launched a missile, we could see it about 3 minutes after it left off the pad. We could see it because we were at the top of the world looking down at them. I was up there for a year, and if you signed for an additional 6 months, you were given a bonus of $10,000. This was more money than I had ever hoped to see. couldn't imagine what $10,000 looked like. So anyway, they would give you $10,000 and they'd give you an R&R to any place in the world you wanted to go, all expense paid if you come back for 6 months. I did it. I rotated back to California with the company that I was working for up north. I worked for the same company that I worked for when I was on the DEW line in Alaska. It was only 2 black people working on this contract at the time. And it was me and another black guy from another site up on the DEW line. And so about 2 years into this contract, they started hiring people out that was getting out of the Air Force. And that's when everything changed. There was a lot of bigoted people that came to work there for this company. Had a guy told me that, I didn't belong there. I mean, what I was doing, white people did. Black people aren't supposed to be doing this. And so I said, well, this is not good. I need to leave. So I started seeking employment otherwise. And I came across this ad in the paper again. And they were advertising for JPL. So I had to come to LA for the interview. I did get the job and went to the Bahamas. After it was proven that the station at the Cape could track the missile through the flame, and we were deactivated. And part of our site went to Newfoundland, and the rest of the site was going to Guam. So I was scheduled to go to Guam to help set up that site when I came to Pasadena. I came to Pasadena because my wife is from Pasadena, and her mother was ill at the time. When I came to Pasadena, I knew Willis was here because he and I had worked together up at Vandenberg. So I looked him up, and I had lunch at the lab one day with him. And I'd never seen so many black people with jobs in my life. Even in the Bahamas, where it's 88% black, I was the only black person on the site. So when I came to Pasadena, I looked up Willis, and he invited me to come to the lab and have lunch with him one day, and I did. And I told him that my wife's mother was ill, and so Willis asked me if I wanted to stay in Pasadena or work at JPL. Well, I wasn't really particular about working at JPL at the time because I was on a career path, and I planned to go to Guam and spend 5 years in Guam and retire. And that would have made me retire at the ripe old age of 45 years old. But it didn't happen. Stayed with, so Willis made me an offer. I accepted it. And so I started working at JPL in 1968 as a tracking data analyst. And what I did was to analyze the tracking data, and from the tracking data generate predictions to tell the stations where to point their antennas and what frequencies to scan to lock on to spacecraft in deep space. Later, I worked in telemetry and command systems as a system analyst. And after that, I was a cognizant operations engineer. During this time, I learned to fly. And I got my private pilot's license. And this is 1978. Got my private pilot's license. And I went forth and got my instrument rating, which meant that I could fly in any weather. And then I got my multi-engine instrument rating, which said that I could fly multi-engine aircraft. And this just goes back to this dream that I had of just riding in an airplane, little knowing that one day I would own an airplane. So I'd done all of this on my GI Bill, and at the time I had money left over in my GI Bill. So to burn the money, I went back to flight training school and trained in the Cessna Citation jet. I knew that I would never own a jet, that I wouldn't be flying a jet, meaning at $500 an hour, but I do have a type rating. I did have a type rating in the session citation. In 86, from 86 to 95 to my retirement, I was a cognizant operation engineer for telemetry and command systems. My career path never led directly to JPL because even though the contract had changed several times since I'd been there, it was carried over, being the time that I had with one contractor was good at the other contractor that I worked for. So that's essentially how I ended up at JPL, never as a JPLer, always a contractor. And I hope that if this goes through, that some young person may see this and see that you can succeed.
My name is Frank Tillman, and start off at how I became an engineer, the passions that drove me to become one, the path that I was on. I went into engineering at the University of Connecticut, graduated in '66. While I'm on my education segment here, I went on after the University of Connecticut and got a bachelor's degree. I also got 2 master's degrees from University of Southern California, Southern Cal, both in engineering in '71 and '75. Onward, I went to JPL. 41 years of aerospace structural analysis and tests. I started out in '66 at Grumman on Long Island in a military plane. And someone says, well, with all those buildings and bridges, what do you want a military plane for, Tillman? I said, well, it's '66 and everybody's going into the military for the Vietnam build-out. And so I took that route for fulfilling that obligation, took the job at the defense concern, which was Grumman. They built military planes for carriers. I did that for a year. And the other side of the complex of Northrop Grumman was the Apollo project, and all we did was just look over there and see what was going on over there. So I said, couldn't wait to get transferred off the military plane onto Apollo, which I eventually did. And I said, well, this is me. In 1967, you're on Apollo, you're in heaven. So 67, if you go through the Apollo, it's the tail end of it. Armstrong's walking on the moon in another year. They said, well, Tillman, if you want to get into the Apollo, you should go to California. And that I did. Worked for Boeing and Downey on the redesign of the Apollo spacecraft after the fire. I think previous person might have spoke about the fire who actually was there. So I worked on the documentation and analysis of the redesign of the spacecraft after the fire. By now it's '69 and Armstrong's on the moon, so I got a job at Lockheed Burbank on a commercial airliner. That's now my second path, deviation from what I wanted. One was the military right out of school with Vietnam, and the other is the Apollo program coming down. But it turned out next day I got a job on this commercial airliner, Lockheed, and that lasted for a few years. There was an opening by Martin, which was merged with Lockheed, that to place somebody at JPL. which I applied for that assignment and took it. Didn't have to move or anything. So I became, I wasn't a JPL direct, but I was, all of these jobs I've had up at Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Long Island are all direct jobs. So this one I'm direct but on loan to JPL. And it was such an exciting place at the time. I rose through the ranks as a doer, a group leader, a supervisor on some exciting projects. Ended my career as a doer and a technical supervisor in '04, but then near the end of my career in '07, I retired. One innovative project I directed was on large JPL spacecraft Galileo, which was one of the first, I believe, the largest payload in the shuttle. And I had to, or my group, under my direction, had to come up with the safety package that would be the pre-launch safety package that had to be prepared and delivered to Johnson Space Center to get pre-launch safety approval to launch this, at the time, gigantic payload in the shuttle, the biggest payload in the shuttle, not only of JPL to that point. There was no template for that particular presentation. Delivered that presentation to Johnson Space Center. I wound up in my career going to all 6 or 7 NASA centers and either working with them or presenting to them, as well as the European Space Agency. I think I was there 3 or 4 times or more. I did make principal engineer. They did call me back for like 8 years after I retired on a part-time basis, and so if anything, gave me some validation of my path and what I did was right. Either that or I flunked retirement. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bill Kent, and this is my story. In 1961, President Kennedy made a commitment to put a man on the moon within the next decade, and the space race was on. I came to JPL in 1963. I had been working for SAS Witters Engineering over at RCA and Sunstein Turbo, because we moved around. It was what they would call a job shop. And so I got an assignment to work at JPL. I had picked up an AA at City College with a major first in drama and then in architecture and then in engineering. Moved to Northrop University. Northrop Grumman had a little campus over there in Englewood where I was studying mechanical design engineering. And one summer, with all the excitement about the space race and so on, I thought I would give it a try and see if I could get me a job actually designing stuff. I just couldn't wait. So I went. I would get up every morning, pack my lunch, go out, and go on interviews every day. And at night, I would go through the papers, find other destinations, go out again. I did that for about 2 or 3 weeks. And finally, I landed a job at SAS Witters Engineering. Thank you, Hal. And I was a happy camper because now I was in a field that I could really enjoy, and I had a passion for it. So in '63, when I came to JPL, I came there as a contractor. JPL was involved in the Ranger program. I worked on Ranger 7, 8, and 9. So they had several Rangers before I arrived. Some of them crash landed, some of them soft landed. But I got in on a 7, 8, and 9 working on the structure. And at that time there were not a lot of black people at JPL, but there were 3 or 4 in the design section that I'd like to mention. A good friend of mine, Jim Allen, and Cliff McCoy, and Roger Bryant, who had his own group later. And we were the only people of color in the design section, which was unusual because most sections maybe had 1 person, maybe 2 at the most. So that was a big number. And then a couple of years later, Carl Raggio invited me to become a JPL employee, and I spent 34 years working with JPL. And it was an interesting career because there was always something challenging happening. It was demanding, and at the same time you couldn't get enough of it because you were on the cutting edge of what was happening. So I worked on Ranger 9, then the surveyor that went to the moon. It was more sophisticated. It even had a device that could dig up some soil and analyze and break it down and then send the information back to Earth. And then finally in July of 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. The space race was on, and we had beat them to first base. I went on to work on quite a few missions to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus. And those were all challenging missions. Oh, also I got to work on the Space Telescope, which is really a great thing. It's out there now, looking into deep space and giving you really pictures that you've never seen before of other planets, other galaxies, actually. And that was one of the last projects I worked on. So but one of the other things I was able to get in on at JPL, they had something called Space Flight Transfer Applications Program. And what they would do, they would take the technology that had been developed at JPL for outer space and try to apply it to the civilian side of the house. And then they would give that to, it became public domain, whatever information they would gather. And so I was chosen by Alex Irons, a scientist, to work on a project concerning dry heat sterilization. And there were 3 of us on the project there, Paul Muter, Dr. Irons, and myself. And we went out to the 2 teaching universities here in town, USC and UCLA Medical Center. And we would have meetings, and the question was, what is your biggest sterilization problem? And they both said that the biggest problem they had was with the ordinary ventilator, kind of a respirator that you hook up the patient to aid in breathing and so forth. That thing, you get all that hot breath in there, you create a lot of germs. It's hard to get it clean. And at that time, they were autoclaving the respirators to get them clean. Well, Dr. Irons told them that the only way you can achieve 100% sterilization with dry heat. At JPL, we take the entire spacecraft and put it in an oven and cook it for a certain period of time. When you take that thing out, it's 100% sterilized. That's why you see the guys walking around with the white smocks and the gloves and so forth. That's all to prevent contamination, because you don't know what could happen if that went into deep space and landed on some planet. Ordinary germ on Earth might end up killing whatever life exists on that planet, or it could turn into a monster like Star Wars or something. So everything had to be 100% sterilized, and dry heat was the way to go. So we took the respirators and we redesigned everything to make them use materials that was dry heat sterilizable, built a filtration system for both the oxygen source and for the patient's breath. And then I would truck them back and forth to UCLA, and they would give me dirty ones to take over and measure, and then we would sterilize it and go back and measure it again. 100% sterilization. And it really became kind of a big deal. We got a write up in National Geographic, and I got Sherry Grizzard. I don't know if you guys remember Sherry. I got her to model the thing. So this big, beautiful picture of Sherry holding the device, and they gave us some money. They gave us a monetary award for it, and also our names got on the patent. That was an exciting project to work on. Some of the other interspace things that I did, I worked on a device that was used to measure the ozone. And this was an ozone scanner that we designed, and we would hook it up to a supersonic fighter jet, and they would just fly across Alaska and measure that ozone and keep up with the size of the ozone, which is getting larger all of the time. And really, it's a serious matter for the future of our planet. I got to work on a device with Roger Bryant's group that was dealing with earthquake slippage along the San Andreas Fault. And we built a mobile device that you could take and set it down on each side of the fault, and then you would shoot a certain quasar and get an exact measurement here, move over here, and do the same measurement, and then triangulate it to get the exact distance from those 2 points. Come back 3 or 4 years later, go to the same points, shoot the same quasar, and you could measure that slippage within a quarter of an inch. Really outstanding stuff. So those were some of the other programs that I involved at JPL. When you think about it, and when you think about JPL, we always are reminded of their ventures into outer space and the space probes that they did, which was very important. But innovation was the big thing, and a lot of that got transferred back to everyday life too. We would not have a common cell phone without micro-miniaturization. And we wouldn't have micro-miniaturization except that it was necessary. If you're going to go into space, you can't carry all of that weight, and so you have to make things lighter and lighter and lighter. And so a lot of the technology that was developed for outer space is now used every day. The other day, my little granddaughter, who is now 5 years old, she had the cell phone there, and I said, "Don't mess with my cell phone. You're gonna jam it up." And she says, "No," and she went and got her program on YouTube. I said, "It's got to be educational." She said, "It is educational. See here," and she's playing this stuff on YouTube and so forth. And I just backed off and let her have the phone because she was more adept than I was at going to her program and getting her program up on the screen. That's where we are now. We were in the space age, but now I submit that we're in the information age. And that's an exciting place to be. Because when most of our careers we had to do a lot of research, and we had libraries available that where we would dig out parts and see what we were going to buy, what we were going to apply, and so forth. And now all of that is at your fingertips. All you got to do is ask Google. There it is. So you don't have to have the right answer. All you have to do is come up with the right question, and the information is at your fingertips. That is exciting. That is phenomenal. That is the time that we're living in. and it's a very exciting time. So thank you for your time. I've enjoyed this event. I would like to thank our filmmaker, Charlene Kent, and we'll see you next time.